The devil draws his maps in sand and bone, and in the Arizona Territory of 1873, the lines were drawn in blood. This isn't just a story of cowboys and Indians. It's the saga of a man haunted by one war who stumbled into another. A young prospector, Nathaniel Granger, found a dying man in the merciless Sonoran Desert. By all laws of survival and hate, he should have left him. But he didn't. He hoisted his sworn enemy, a wounded Apache warrior, onto his horse and carried him toward a fate he could not imagine. This single act of mercy was a stone tossed into a silent canyon, and its echo would determine the future of the entire territory. He didn't know his wounded cargo was a secret, that men would kill for a secret that would make him the most wanted man in the West. The sun was a merciless hammer on the devil's anvil, and Nathaniel Granger felt like a horseshoe being beaten into submission. For 3 days, the Sonoran Desert had worked on him, baking the moisture from his skin, cracking his lips, and filling his head with the buzz of a solitary, determined horsefly. His mule Hester was the only other living thing that seemed to share his misery. Her head hung low, her occasional snorts, little puffs of dust and despair. Nate wasn't a man built for this land. Not really. He was from Tennessee, a place of rolling green hills and damp, heavy air. The war had stolen that home from him. He'd worn the gray of the Confederacy fought at Shiloh, where the air was thick with screams instead of humidity, and had seen enough of men dying for flags and philosophies to last 100 lifetimes. He came west to escape ghosts, to find a place so empty it couldn't hold any memories. He'd heard there was gold in the Arizona hills, a shining, solid truth you could hold in your hand. So far, all he'd found was shimmering heat and varying shades of brown. He was scanning the horizon, a ritual of hope and futility, when Hester suddenly stopped. Her ears, long and expressive, swiveled forward, locked onto something to their right. "What is it, girl?" Nate murmured, his voice a dry rasp. He followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing but a cluster of sun-bleached rocks and skeletal ocotillo cacti. Then a flicker of movement. Not an animal. It was a splash of faded color against the dun-colored earth. Nate's hand went instinctively to the walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. In this land, anything unexpected was a threat, until proven otherwise. He dismounted the sand crunching under his worn boots and pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. Holding the rifle in a low, ready position, he moved toward the rocks with a caution he'd learned in the wooded ambushes of his home state. The heat was a physical presence pressing down on his shoulders. A lizard skittered away from his path. As he rounded the largest boulder, he saw it. A man. An Apache. He was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. His deerskin leggings were torn and stained dark with blood, a patch of crimson soaking through the back of his simple tunic just below the shoulder blade. A scattering of black hair, matted with sweat and dirt, fanned out around his head. He was young, maybe Nate's age, early 20s at most. There was no horse, no weapons. Only the man himself, a piece of human wreckage left for the vultures. Nate's first thought was pure, unadulterated pragmatism. Leave him. This was an Apache. A Chiricahua by the look of his moccasins and the simple, unadorned style of his dress. His people were at war, or something like it, with everyone. They raided settlements. They fought the cavalry. They were a ghost-like menace that the newspapers in Tucson screamed about. To a white man, an Apache was a promise of a violent death. To help one was to invite that death into your camp. He circled the body, Winchester still aimed. The man wasn't moving. Nate nudged him with the toe of his boot. A low groan, so faint it was nearly lost in the wind, escaped the man's lips. He was alive. That changed things. It was one thing to leave a dead man to the desert. It was another to watch a living one die. The ghosts of Shiloh stirred in Nate's memory, boys in blue and grey lying in the mud, groaning for water, for their mothers, for an end to the pain. He had walked past so many of them, his own survival, a frantic, screaming priority. He had promised himself if he ever got out of that hell, he would never again walk away from a man he could help. He hadn't specified which colour that man would be. Damn it all to hell, Nate swore the words, tasting like dust. He knelt, laying his rifle aside. Gently, he rolled the Apache over. The man's face was lean with high cheekbones and a strong jaw now slack with pain and exhaustion. His skin was the colour of fired pottery fever, hot to the touch. His eyes fluttered open, dark and fathomless, but unfocused. They stared up at Nate without recognition, clouded with delirium. The wound in his back was a ragged, ugly thing, a bullet hole. It was inflamed, the edges puffy and red. Infection was already setting in. Without water and care, he'd be dead by sundown. Nate looked at his canteens, one nearly full, one half full, barely enough for him and Hester to make it to the next known spring, 2 days' ride north. Sharing it with a third, a wounded man who would sweat out more than he took in, was suicide. He stood up, pacing a small, tight circle. The arguments fought a war in his head. He's Apache. He'd kill you for your boots and your mule the second he was strong enough. The counter-argument was not a voice, but an image. A young corporal from Georgia named Billy. His guts spilled out by a bayonet, begging Nate for a drink of water. Nate had kept walking. The memory had been a burr under his saddle for 8 years. He looked down at the Apache. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. He was dying, alone, in the dirt. God forgive me if I'm wrong, Nate said to the empty sky. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resolve, he uncorked his half-full canteen, lifted the Apache's head, and dribbled a little of the precious water onto his cracked lips. The man swallowed convulsively, a flicker of consciousness returning to his dark eyes. For a moment, those eyes focused on Nate. There was no gratitude in them, only a deep, burning, primal suspicion. It was the look of a wolf caught in a trap watching the farmer approach. Nate didn't care. He'd made his choice. Getting the man onto Hester was a nightmare. He was limp, a dead weight, and Nate wasn't a big man. It was a clumsy, grunting affair of heaving and slipping, the Apache groaning in pain as his wound was jostled. Finally, Nate managed to get him draped over the mule's back face, down his arms and legs dangling. It was an undignified position, but it was the only way. He took up Hester's lead rope. His own supplies, a pickaxe, a shovel, a small sack of beans and bacon, were now secondary to the life of an enemy. He adjusted his hat against the sun and began to walk, leading the mule north. He was now on foot, sharing his water with a dying Apache in the middle of the most hostile land he had ever known. The gold seemed very far away now. The ghosts, however, felt a little further away, too. For the rest of that day, they moved in silence, broken only by Hester's weary snorts and the Apache's pained murmurs. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat lessened, but a new chill crept into the air. Nate knew the man wouldn't survive a desert night in his condition, without warmth and proper attention to his wound. He found a shallow arroyo, a dried-up creek bed that offered some meager protection from the wind. He eased the Apache off the mule and laid him down gently. The man was shivering now, his fever spiking. Nate worked quickly. He gathered dry mesquite branches and, using his flint and steel, managed to coax a small, precious fire to life. The flames pushed back the encroaching darkness, a tiny island of civilization in a vast, wild sea. He took out his knife and a strip of clean cloth from his saddlebag. Looking at the festering wound, he knew what he had to do. He had seen field surgeons do it in the war. It was brutal, but necessary. He heated the tip of his knife in the fire until it glowed a dull red. The Apache's eyes were open, watching him, a new look dawning in them fear. He understood what was coming. He tried to push himself up, a guttural word escaping his throat. "Easy now," Nate said, his voice low and calm, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "Easy, this has to be done. It's this or the fever takes you." He put a knee on the man's good shoulder, pinning him down. The Apache struggled, but he was too weak. Nate took a deep breath, steadied his hand, and pressed the glowing tip of the knife into the bullet hole. A strangled, inhuman scream tore from the Apache's throat, echoing off the walls of the arroyo. His body arched in agony. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a sickeningly familiar scent that threw Nate back to the smoldering fields of Shiloh. He held the knife there for a long, terrible second, cauterizing the wound to stop the bleeding and burn out the poison. Then it was over. He pulled the knife away. The Apache collapsed unconscious, his body slick with sweat. Nate, shaking, wiped his brow with the back of a trembling hand. He bandaged the wound with the clean cloth. He sat back on his heels, utterly spent, and looked at the man he had just tortured in order to save. He didn't know his name. He didn't know his story. He only knew that their fates were now tied together for better or for worse on the anvil of the Sonoran desert. The dawn came cold and grey, the sun a pale disk behind a thin veil of clouds. The Apache was still unconscious, but his breathing was deeper, more regular. The shivering had stopped. Nate allowed himself a sliver of hope. He had survived the night. Nate rationed a mouthful of water and a few hard biscuits for himself, saving the rest. The nearness of the next spring was a constant nagging prayer in his mind. He checked the bandage on the Apache's back. It was clean, the horrific burn having done its work. The flesh around it was still angry and red, but the telltale streaks of advanced infection were gone. He was reloading Hester, preparing for another day's trudge, when the Apache stirred. His eyes opened, and this time they were clear. He blinked slowly, taking in the small fire, the mule, and Nate. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at his wound. He looked at Nate, and for the first time spoke. His voice was weak, but the words were sharp, guttural. Nate didn't understand the language, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a question. "Who are you? Why?" Nate just shook his head. "Don't speak his tongue," he said, pointing to himself. "Name's Nathaniel Granger." The Apache stared at him, his gaze intense. He seemed to be processing the situation. A white man, a prospector. By his look had found him treated his wound and hadn't killed him. It was a scenario for which his life experience had no precedent. He gestured weakly toward the canteen. Nate understood. He brought it over and helped him drink. The Apache drank slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Nate's face. When he was done, he sank back exhausted, by the small effort. The day's journey was a slow, arduous repeat of the last. Nate walked, leading Hester, upon which the now conscious Apache rode. He refused to be draped over the saddle like a sack of flour, insisting on sitting upright, a ramrod of pride even in his weakened state. He swayed with every step, his face a mask of stoic pain, but he did not complain. They didn't speak. There was no common language between them, but a silent communication began to form, built of gestures and shared glances. When Hester stumbled, both men reached out to steady her. When a rattlesnake buzzed angrily from a rocky crevice, the Apache gave a sharp, low whistle of warning just as Nate was about to step near it. Nate shot the snake, and that night they shared its roasted meat over another small fire, a welcome change from dry biscuits. During that meal, the Apache pointed to himself. "Kyle," he said. The name was short, sharp, like a striking hawk. Nate nodded, pointing to his own chest. "Nate," Nate Kyle repeated. The name sounded foreign on his tongue, but it was a bridge, a fragile, rickety bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. The next day they reached the spring. It was a miracle of green in a world of brown, a small pool of clear, life-giving water, shaded by a cluster of cottonwood trees. Hester drank greedily. Nate refilled his canteens, splashing the cool water on his own face, feeling life seep back into him. Kyle slid off the mule and lowered himself to the edge of the pool, drinking deeply before cleaning his wound with a startlingly gentle touch. They rested there for half a day, letting the water and the shade work their magic. For the first time, Nate felt like they might actually make it where he still wasn't sure. He figured he would take Kyle to the edge of the Chiricahua lands and leave him there. A drop-off, a completed task. Then he could go back to his search for gold, his quest for an empty life. It was Kyle who discovered the tracks. As Nate was packing up, Kyle, who had been scouting the perimeter of their small oasis, let out a low grunt. He beckoned Nate over. There, in a patch of soft sand, were hoof prints. 3 horses. Shod. Not Apache ponies. They were recent, no more than a day old. But it wasn't the tracks that had Kyle's attention. It was what lay beside them. A spent rifle cartridge. .44-40 caliber, common enough. But next to it, glinting in the sun, was a small silver concho, shaped like a vulture's skull. Kyle looked at the concho, then at Nate. He pointed to the tracks, then to his own back, and made a shooting motion with his hand. The meaning was clear. The men who left these tracks were the men who shot him. Bounty hunters. The vulture skull was their sign. A cold dread settled in Nate's stomach. This wasn't just a random act of violence. Kyle was being hunted. And now so was Nate. He had picked up a stray, and that stray was leading a pack of wolves right to his door. "We need to go," Nate said, his voice grim. "Now." Kyle nodded, his face hard. The brief respite was over. The desert was no longer their only enemy. They pushed on, moving faster now, the shared threat adding a new urgency to their pace. They left the relative safety of the flatlands and entered a labyrinth of canyons and mesas, a landscape of sharp edges and sudden drops. It was harder going, but it offered more cover. 2 days later they saw them. Nate and Kyle were resting on a high ridge, looking back the way they had come. Far below, 3 riders emerged from the haze. They were tiny figures in the vast landscape, but their intent was as clear as the sky above. They were moving steadily, tracking them. Even from this distance, Nate could see the sun glint off something one of the riders was wearing. A silver concho. "The vultures," Nate muttered. Kyle said nothing, but his hand tightened on the handle of the skinning knife Nate had given him. They scrambled, leading Hester down the far side of the ridge, seeking the shadows of the canyons. The chase was on. It was a silent, desperate game of cat and mouse played out across a stone chessboard the size of a state. Nate's knowledge of the terrain was non-existent, but Kyle seemed to have an innate sense of the land. He would point, indicating a box canyon, to be avoided, a hidden game trail that would shave off miles a rock formation that would hide their tracks. He was weak-wounded, but in his element. Nate, the man from the green hills of Tennessee, was a clumsy child here. He learned to trust the Apache's instincts completely. The hunters were relentless. They were led by a man Nate would later learn was named Silas Kane, a notorious manhunter who favored collecting Apache scalps over government bounties because the paperwork was simpler. Kane was a master tracker, and his 2 men were just as skilled. They couldn't be shaken. The climax came in a narrow wash with sheer rock walls on either side. Kane and his men had managed to circle ahead, cutting them off. They appeared at the end of the wash, blocking the only way out, rifles raised. "Well, well," a voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. It was a gravelly, unpleasant sound. "Look what the cat dragged in, boys. A gut-shot Apache and his little white nursemaid." The speaker was a tall, gaunt man on a black horse. He had a long, drooping mustache and eyes like chips of flint. A silver vulture skull was pinned to his hatband. Silas Kane. "The boy there has a price on his head." "Friend." Kane continued, his rifle aimed squarely at Nate's chest. "A big one. $500 from the army. More from some private interests. You can walk away. Leave the mule. Just turn around and go." $500. It was a fortune. More money than Nate had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy a small ranch to start over for real. All he had to do was walk away. The same choice he'd faced a week ago, but this time with a gun to his chest and a fortune on the table. He looked at Kyle. The Apache sat on the mule, his face impassive, but his eyes were locked on Nate. There was no plea in them, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. He was watching to see what kind of man Nathaniel Granger truly was. The ghosts of Shiloh were silent. They had been replaced by the memory of a shared canteen, a roasted snake, and a single spoken name. Nate's hand drifted down slowly toward his colt. "I reckon he's with me," Nate said, his voice quiet but steady. Kane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Wrong answer." He raised his rifle to fire. But before he could, Kyle let out a piercing war cry. He kicked Hester hard, sending the startled mule bucking and scrambling sideways. At the same time, he threw the skinning knife. It wasn't a perfect throw. His wound made him weak, but it served its purpose. It flew past Kane's head, forcing him to duck and momentarily spoiling his aim. That was all the opening Nate needed. He drew the peacemaker and fired not at Kane, but at the rock face just above his head. The bullet sparked, sending a shower of rock chips and dust down into the hunters' faces. "Go," Nate yelled, shoving Hester's rump hard, sending her and Kyle scrambling back up the wash. He fired 2 more shots, providing cover, before turning and sprinting after them, the hunters' curses and bullets whining past his ears. They had escaped, but just barely. They were alive, but now they were running for their lives with a price on one of their heads and a pack of human vultures on their trail who would never, ever give up. Flight became their new reality. The close call in the wash had stripped away any illusion of a casual journey. Silas Kane was not a man to be trifled with, and the bounty on Kyle's head transformed him from a simple wounded man into a walking treasure chest. Nate no longer thought about dropping him off. He was in this now bound to Kyle by a shared enemy, and the lead flying past their heads. Kyle, despite his improving physical state, seemed to be drawing inward. The stoicism he'd shown earlier was now tinged with a deep melancholy. He would ride for hours, staring at the horizon, his face a mask of concerns that went far beyond the hunters on their trail. Nate sensed it was something more than the bounty. The $500 was a white man's price. Kyle's troubles felt older, deeper. Their destination became a place Nate had heard whispers of from other prospectors, the Mission San Javier del Bac, south of Tucson. Not the restored, active mission, but its forgotten ruins, a place called the White Dove of the Desert, by some, and a ghost by others. It was said to be a place of sanctuary, respected and avoided by the local Apache tribes for reasons lost to time. It was a long shot, a gamble based on saloon gossip, but it was the only plan they had. The journey south was a blur of dust and fear. They traveled by night, the moon their only guide, and hid during the day in kevis and thickets, erasing their tracks as best they could. Kyle taught Nate how to use broad leaves to sweep away their footprints, how to choose a path over rock instead of sand. Nate, in turn, managed their dwindling supplies with a soldier's discipline, making a handful of beans and a strip of jerky feel like a feast. One evening, as they huddled behind a rock outcropping, Kyle broke the silence. He had been scratching in the dirt with a stick. He showed it to Nate. It was a crude drawing of a mountain, a distinctive peak with a flat top. Then he drew a circle, a family or a camp at its base. He pointed to the circle, then tapped his own chest. His home. Then his face hardened. He drew a second, smaller circle near the first. He drew a line from it that struck his drawing of himself, then made a snake-like, treacherous motion with his hand. Nate struggled to understand. Another camp. An enemy. Kyle's expression clarified it. It was not a white man's attack he was depicting. The ambush that left him for dead hadn't just been Kane's men. They had been guided, betrayed, by his own people. The weight on Kyle's shoulders suddenly made sense. He was not just a warrior wounded by his enemies. He was an exile hunted by his own kind as well as the white man. The $500 bounty was merely a tool. This revelation changed the texture of their companionship. Nate saw not just a warrior, but a man grappling with a profound betrayal, a loneliness that mirrored his own. The ghosts of Shiloh had been born of a war between brothers north and south. Kyle's wounds were from a similar, more intimate conflict. After nearly a week of relentless travel, they saw it. Rising from the desert floor like a bleached bone, the ruins of the Mission San Javier. Its white towers were crumbling, the great dome of its roof open to the sky, but it possessed a haunting, desolate beauty. It felt ancient, sacred, and blessedly empty. They made their camp in the cavernous, cool interior of the old church. Sunlight streamed through the collapsed roof, illuminating faded frescoes of saints and angels on the plaster walls. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant, wind-swept noise of the open desert. It felt safe. Here in this sanctuary, Kyle finally began to open up. His English was halting, pieced together from words Nate had taught him, and a surprising number he already knew, likely picked up in trading or skirmishes. "My father, he is Nantan Kyle," said one evening, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Chief." He spoke the word with a mixture of pride and pain. "Mangas, a great warrior, but he is old." His hands shake. He went on to explain in fragmented sentences and expressive gestures the situation within his Chiricahua band. His father, Chief Mangas, was a proponent of peace, believing their only chance of survival was to negotiate with the white settlers to find a way to coexist. But a younger, more aggressive warrior named Goyathlai, a name Nate had heard, whispered with fear, sometimes called Geronimo, by the Mexicans, preached a gospel of perpetual war. Goyathlai believed peace was a lie, a slow death. He had allies, those who saw Mangas's diplomacy as weakness. "They say father is a woman," Kael said, spitting the word out like a curse. "They want war. Blood." Kael was his father's chosen heir. He was the future of his father's vision of peace. That was why he was a threat to Goyathlai's faction. He had been on his way to a secret council with other like-minded Apache leaders when he was ambushed. He was certain it was one of Goyathlai's warriors who had led Silas Kane to him. "The bounty. It is an excuse," Kael finished, his eyes dark with understanding. "They want me dead, so Goyathlai can be chief. So the war will never end." Nate sat in stunned silence, the flickering firelight playing across Kael's earnest face. This was no simple fugitive he had been dragging across the desert. This was a prince, the heir to a kingdom, and the linchpin in a struggle for the soul of his people. The fate of thousands, Apache and white alike, could rest on this young man's survival. Nate's act of mercy had inadvertently thrust him into the very center of the conflict he had come west to escape. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. He looked around the ruined church at the faded saints who offered no guidance. He was just a prospector, a man running from his own past. How had he become the guardian of a nation's future? Their sanctuary, however, was about to be violated. Unbeknownst to them, news of Kane's hunt had reached the ears of the U.S. Army. In Tucson, a man named Major Elias Thorne, a career soldier with a rigid sense of order and a deep disdain for bounty hunters, took an interest. He didn't want a private citizen like Kane stirring up the hornet's nest that was the Chiricahua. The official bounty on Kael, listed as a renegade responsible for a raid he did not commit, was Thorne's justification. He dispatched his own patrols, not just to catch the Apache prince, but to intercept the bounty hunters as well. The desert was becoming crowded. One of those patrols, led by a savvy sergeant named O'Malley, found their trail. He was a better tracker than Kane, less theatrical but more methodical. He wasn't fooled by the rock paths or the swept-clean sand. He followed the almost invisible signs of their passage with the patient certainty of a wolf. A few days after they'd settled into the mission, Kael, perched high in one of the crumbling bell towers, let out a sharp hiss. Nate scrambled up the precarious stone steps to join him. Far to the north, a dust cloud. Too organized for cattle, too slow for a dust devil. It was riders, a dozen of them moving in a disciplined column. Nate saw the glint of the sun on metal, the flash of a yellow cavalry stripe. Army Nate breathed. They looked to the east, another smaller dust cloud. 3 riders, moving fast erratically. Kane Kael said, his voice grim. They were trapped. The law was coming from one direction, lawlessness from the other. The sanctuary had become a tomb. Kael looked at Nate, his face etched with the despair of a chess player who sees the checkmate 3 moves away. There was nowhere left to run. The whispers of the old mission were about to be drowned out by the roar of gunfire. The mission, once a symbol of sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The crumbling adobe walls offered cover, but also confinement. To the north, the approaching blue column of Major Thorne's cavalry. To the east, the ragged, vengeful trio of Silas Kane's bounty hunters. Nate and Kyle were the morsel of meat between two snapping jaws. "They'll meet at the entrance," Kyle observed, his voice low and steady. He had regained the composure of a warrior. The time for despair was over. The time for tactics had begun. "The soldiers will be slow by the book. Kane will be fast like a snake. Kane wants the bounty." Nate reasoned, his mind racing, falling back on the military logic he thought he'd left behind. "He can't collect if the army takes you. He'll try to get to us first, kill you and take proof. A scalp." The word hung in the air, ugly and visceral. "He will not have it," Kyle said, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. They had Nate's Winchester, his Colt Peacemaker, and about 40 rounds of ammunition between them. Kyle had his knife. It was pitifully little against a cavalry patrol and 3 dedicated killers. Their only advantage was the terrain. The mission was a maze of collapsed chapels, overgrown courtyards, and shadowy cloisters. They knew its layout. Their pursuers did not. As predicted, Kane and his 2 men, spurred by the sight of the cavalry, charged ahead. They galloped toward the mission's southern, more broken-down entrance, hoping to get inside and find Kyle before the soldiers could establish a perimeter. "They will split up," Kyle whispered, pointing from their perch in the bell tower. "To search faster." "Then so do we," Nate replied. "We can't win a straight fight. We have to pick them off, one by one." It was a desperate, ugly plan. An ambush. The kind of fighting Nate hated, the kind that reminded him too much of the Tennessee woods. He gave Kyle the Winchester. With his keen eyes, he was the better shot, even with his wounded shoulder. Nate would take the pistol and use the close quarters of the ruins to his advantage. They separated, melting into the shadows of the old church. The air grew thick with tension. The only sounds were the cawing of crows and the frantic beating of Nate's own heart. Silas Kane was arrogant. He entered the main church, the great chamber where Nate and Kyle had camped, his boots crunching on fallen debris. "Come on out, boy," he called, his voice a mocking drawl. "Let's get this over with. Don't want you falling into the hands of those blue bellies. They'll just hang you. I can make it quick." One of his men, a burly, bearded man named Jeb, circled around toward the old friar's quarters. The third, a weasel-faced tracker called Creek Johnson, slunk towards the overgrown graveyard. They were spreading a net. From a high window, Kyle drew a bead on Creek Johnson as he moved between the tilted, weathered crosses. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's crack was deafening in the silence. Johnson cried out and fell, clutching a leg. Not a kill shot, a deliberate tactical wound. One man down and another would have to help him. Jeb, hearing the shot and the cry, cursed and ran toward the graveyard. Kane, however, was smarter. He realized the shot came from above and ducked behind a massive stone altar, using it for cover. Now it was Nate's turn. He crept through a series of collapsed archways, circling toward the friar's quarters, to head off Jeb. He flattened himself behind a wall as the big man lumbered past, his rifle held at the ready. Nate let him pass, then stepped out behind him. "Drop it!" Nate ordered, the Colt steady in his hand. Jeb spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. For a second, he considered raising his rifle, but the black hole of the Peacemaker's muzzle, just 15 feet away, changed his mind. He let the rifle clatter to the ground. "Smart man." Nate said, his voice tight. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the main church. Kane. He wasn't shooting at anything, just firing to create chaos to draw attention. It worked. From outside the mission walls, a bugle sounded. The cavalry had arrived and were now on high alert. Major Thorn. Inside, a voice yelled from the perimeter. "This is United States Cavalry. Lay down your arms and come out." The situation had just become infinitely more complex. Nate knew he couldn't hold Jeb for long. He had to neutralize him. He gestured with his pistol. "The cellar. Move." He marched the big bounty hunter to a dark, stone-lined cellar he and Kyle had discovered and locked him inside, barricading the heavy wooden door with a fallen beam. One down. But their problems were multiplying. Soldiers were beginning to cautiously enter the mission grounds from the north. Kane was still pinned down behind the altar, and Kyle was still in the tower. But Creek Johnson, his leg bleeding, was now providing cover fire for Kane from the graveyard. It was a true three-way siege. The twist, the one Nate could never have anticipated, came not from a rifle, but from a familiar wheezing voice. "Nathaniel. Is that you, boy?" Nate froze. He knew that voice. He peered through a crack in the adobe wall. Standing near the cavalry commander, Major Thorn was a stooped figure with a familiar shock of white hair and a perpetually worried expression. It was Dusty Pete, an old down-on-his-luck prospector. Nate had shared a campfire with a few weeks back just outside of Tucson. He had told the old man of his fruitless search for gold, his general direction of travel. Dusty Pete, desperate for a few dollars, had clearly sold that information. He must have overheard talk of Kane's hunt, and the bounty put two and two together, and led the cavalry straight to them. It was a betrayal born not of malice, but of weakness. In some ways, that felt even worse. Major Thorn, a man with a stern, clean-shaven face and impatient eyes, was using a spyglass to survey the mission. "You in there, Granger? I have a witness who says you're harboring the Apache fugitive Kyle. You are abetting a known hostile. This is your only warning. Surrender the fugitive, and you may be shown leniency." Nate's heart sank. His name was known. He was no longer an anonymous Good Samaritan. He was an accomplice, a criminal. The gunfire intensified. Kane, realizing his time was running out, began firing wildly toward the tower, trying to suppress Kyle. The soldiers, unsure of who was who, began returning fire at any muzzle flash they saw. Bullets ricocheted off the ancient stone, chipping away at the silent saints. Kyle scrambled down from the tower, realizing it was now a death trap. He joined Nate in the main church, his face grim. "They will storm the walls soon." "I know," Nate said. They were trapped. If Kane got to them, Kyle would be killed instantly. If the cavalry got to them, Kyle would be taken in the chains to be tried and hanged, and Nate would be imprisoned for years. The peace Kyle's father dreamed of would die with him. In that moment, looking at the determined face of the Apache prince, Nate saw the only way out. It wasn't a way out for him, but it was for Kyle. "When they come," Nate said, speaking quickly, "they will come through that main archway. It's the biggest entrance. They'll focus there." Kyle nodded, listening intently. "I'm going to draw their fire." Nate continued, his mind settling with a strange, cold clarity. He was no longer running from the ghosts of Shiloh. He was about to face them down. "I'll make a run for the east wall. It will pull Kane and the soldiers that way. It will give you a window. A few seconds. You go north through the cloisters. The wall is lowest there. Get out, get to the hills. Don't stop, Kyle stared at him, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. They will kill you. They'll be busy shooting at me, Nate countered with a grim smile. Not you. You have to get back to your father. You told me yourself. This is bigger than us. It was a suicidal plan, a sacrifice, the kind of thing men in stories did. Nate never thought of himself as that kind of man. But looking at Kyle, he realized he wasn't doing it for a flag or a cause. He was doing it for a friend. I owe you a life, Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. He was referring to the rattlesnake. No, Nate said, handing him the last full strip of jerky from his pouch. You owe your people a future. Now go. Before Kyle could argue, Nate took a deep breath, chambered around in his Colt, and burst from cover, sprinting across the open plaza toward the eastern wall, firing his pistol into the air. He's running for it, a soldier shouted. Instantly, every rifle seemed to turn on him. Kane, Jeb, and the cavalry all opened fire. Dust and stone chips exploded around Nate's running feet. It was a mad, desperate dash, a final defiant act. And as the guns roared, Kyle slipped away into the northern shadows, a ghost disappearing back into the desert that had birthed him. The world dissolved into a cacophony of thunder and pain. A sledgehammer slammed into Nate's left thigh, sending him tumbling head over heels into the dust. Another blow struck his shoulder, spinning him around. He landed hard on his back, the sky, a blinding, indifferent blue above him. The Colt peacemaker slipped from his numb fingers. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ringing in Nate's ears and the distant, triumphant shout of Silas Kane. I got him. The renegade's partner is down. Through a haze of pain, Nate saw figures approaching. Kane was in the lead, his vulture-like face split in a greasy smile, a smoking pistol in his hand. Major Thorne and his soldiers were close behind their expressions, a mixture of grim duty and professional caution. Kane reached him first. He loomed over Nate, kicking the Colt away. Now where's that redskin of yours? He snarled, nudging Nate's wounded leg with his boot. Nate cried out a raw, involuntary sound. You tell me where he is, and I'll make sure the Major knows you cooperated. Go to hell. Nate gasped, the coppery taste of blood and dust in his mouth. Kane's smile vanished. He raised his pistol to press it against Nate's forehead. Last chance, boy. That's enough. Kane Major Thorne's voice was sharp as cracked ice. He and two soldiers leveled their rifles at the bounty hunter. This man is a prisoner of the United States Army now. Step away. Kane hesitated, his eyes flickering between the Major's cold stare and Nate's defiant, pain-racked face. He was weighing the value of a dead witness against the certainty of being shot down by federal troops. With a curse, he spat on the ground next to Nate's head and backed away. He's worthless to you alive. The Apache is gone. Thorne ignored him, kneeling beside Nate. A medic was already at work, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his trousers. You're Nathaniel Granger. Nate nodded, gritting his teeth as the medic probed the wound. You led us on a hell of a chase, Mr. Granger. Thorne said, his tone more one of weary observation than anger. All for a murderous savage. He's not... Nate began, but his voice failed him. The world was starting to swim at the edges. Save your strength, Thorne commanded. You'll have plenty of time to tell your stories at a military tribunal. They carried him back into the mission, laying him on a blanket in the shade of the great church. They had captured Kane's men Jeb from the cellar and Creek Johnson from the graveyard and were placing them in irons. Silas Kane himself was being questioned by Thorne, his protestations loud and angry. Nate drifted in and out of consciousness. He was a prisoner. Kyle, he prayed, had made it away clean. His sacrifice had to have meant something. He thought of the war, of all the men who had died for nothing, for a few feet of muddy ground. He hoped this was different. He was wrong about one thing. Kyle hadn't run far. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the desert, a lone figure appeared on the ridge overlooking the mission. He was on foot, standing tall and motionless against the fiery sky. It was Kyle. A soldier spotted him. "Major, look." Every eye turned to the ridge. Kyle stood there in plain sight, the Winchester held not in a threatening manner, but resting on his shoulder. It was an act of unbelievable boldness. Major Thorne stared through his spyglass, his mouth a thin, hard line. "It's him. What in God's name is he doing?" Then Kyle raised a hand, palm open. A sign of peace. A parley. "Hold your fire," Thorne commanded. Seeing Kane, raise his own rifle. "Hold your fire." Slowly, deliberately, Kyle began to walk down from the ridge toward the mission. He was walking back into the cage he had just escaped. Nate, watching from his blanket, felt a surge of despair. "No, you fool. What are you doing?" Kyle stopped 100 yards from the mission walls. A solitary, defiant figure. Major Thorne, Kyle's voice, clear and strong, carried across the distance. His English was better than Nate had ever heard it, saved for a moment when it mattered most. "I am Kyle, son of Mangus chief of the Chiricahua." A murmur went through the soldiers. They knew the name Mangus. This wasn't just any renegade. "The man you have shot, Nathaniel Granger, is not a criminal," Kyle declared. "He saved my life when your bounty hunters left me to die. He showed me honor when my own people showed me betrayal. He is a man of peace." Thorne listened, his face unreadable. "I will not see an honorable man punished for my life," Kyle continued. "I will surrender to you to face your justice, but on one condition. You will let him go. You will see that his wounds are treated, and you will give him a horse and supplies, and allow him to ride away a free man. His life for mine." It was an incredible offer, a prince trading himself for a prospector. Silas Kane was apoplectic. "Don't listen to him, Major. It's a trick. Take them both." "Major." Thorne was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Kale. He looked at the proud Apache, then back at the wounded man on the blanket, then at the snarling, greedy face of Silas Kane. Thorne was a man of the army, a man of rules and regulations. But he was also a man who had seen enough of the West to recognize truth when it stood before him bare and undeniable. He saw a choice not between a soldier and a criminal, but between the future of the territory, a future of endless, bloody war represented by Kane, or a slim, fragile chance for peace represented by the bond between the two men before him. Sergeant Thorne said, his voice quiet but firm. "Take Mr. Kane's weapon. Place him and his men under arrest for illegal manhunting and the attempted murder of a prisoner in military custody." Kane's jaw dropped. "What, you can't? I was working for you. You were working for blood money," Kane Thorne said coldly as his men seized the sputtering bounty hunter. "And your work here is done." He turned back toward Kyle. "You have my word, son of Mangus. Mr. Granger will be treated and set it free. But I will have to take you to the fort." Kyle nodded once, a gesture of profound dignity. He laid the Winchester on the ground and walked forward. His hands held out, not in surrender, but as if sealing a pact. The next few days were a blur for Nate. The army surgeon, a surprisingly gentle man, removed the bullet from his thigh. He was given food water, and his wounds were bandaged. He was treated not as a prisoner, but as something of an honored guest. He saw Kyle only once more as he was being placed on a horse to be escorted to the fort. The Apache prince looked at him, and there was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. He gave Nate a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a final acknowledgement. On the third day, Major Thorne came to him. "Your friend drove a hard bargain, Granger, but a deal's a deal." He pointed to Hester, loaded not with prospecting gear, but with 2 full canteens and sacks of food. "The mule is yours. We've added a horse. You're free to go." And Kyle Nate asked, his voice hoarse. "He's making his case to the territorial governor." Thorne said, a strange hint of admiration in his voice. "He's not talking like a renegade. He's talking like a diplomat, speaking of his father's desire for peace of the factions that want war. He's using your story, the story of what you did, as proof that peace between our peoples is possible." Thorne shook his head slightly. He may just be the smartest man in this whole damn territory. He turned his own surrender into a political negotiation. Will they listen? They might. Thorne admitted. A new treaty is possible. A treaty built on the word of the chief's son. A peace brokered by the actions of a stubborn prospector. He looked Nate in the eye. "You didn't find any gold out here, Mr. Granger, but you may have stumbled upon something a hell of a lot more valuable." Nathaniel Granger swung himself into the saddle of the horse the army had given him. His leg ached, his shoulder was stiff, but for the first time in years the ghosts of Shiloh were silent. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had forged a new one in the crucible of the desert. He looked south toward the high, flat-topped mountain Kyle had drawn in the dirt. He didn't know if peace would hold or if war was inevitable. He didn't know if he would ever see Kyle again. But he knew that his life and the life of the Apache Heir would forever be an echo in the great, silent canyons of the West, a story of an impossible friendship, and a testament to the fact that even in a land defined by hatred, a single act of mercy could change the map for everyone. He turned his horse north and rode away from the mission, not toward a fortune in gold, but toward a future he had earned. The story of Nathaniel Granger and Kyle doesn't end with a triumphant battle or a chest full of gold. It ends with a choice, a sacrifice, and the quiet revolutionary idea that our common humanity can be stronger than our deepest hatreds. Their journey across the desert wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. Nate, haunted by the ghosts of one war, found his peace by preventing another. Kyle, the heir to a nation, learned that an enemy could become the truest of allies. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by the extraordinary choices of ordinary people in impossible situations. What would you have done? Would you have left him in the desert? If this story of grit, honor, and unlikely friendship moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a true Western saga, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more tales from the dust-choked pages of history coming your way. Thank you for listening.